A very good morning to you. I trust your morning is coming along just great. A very warm welcome to Power Breakfast. My name is Terry Ann Chebet, and it's just a day to Budget Day, which will be announced tomorrow, and we're ready to unpack and interrogate those numbers for you. My host today, co-host Mutegi Njau, Ken Gishinga, Chief Economist, Mentoria Consulting, and Eric Musau, Senior Research Associate at Standard Investment Bank. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I guess perhaps first impressions. The budget policy statement was released in February. Ken, let's start off with you. What were your first impressions?
I think it's one of the most ambitious budgets in Kenya's history. It's by far the largest. We're looking at they're targeting a revenue of about 1.49 trillion and expenditure of about 2.26 billion. So I think it's the kind of budget that is supposed to unlock the potential of this country from an infrastructure perspective. We are seeing a lot of expenditure on the standard gauge railway, on roads, on the ports in Mombasa, on LAPSSET. So I think it's a very ambitious budget, and I think if managed well, of course, with the debt part being very sustainable, then we are likely to see more growth prospects for this country.
All right, ambitious indeed. Some say it's done perfectly just before an election year. But we'll get into that in just a moment. Eric, what about you? What were your first impressions?
I think the bigger the budget gets, the main concern, and especially from a stock market perspective, is really how government is going to raise the level of funds required in terms of debt and also in terms of taxes. We've had quite a number of tax reforms which have been implemented over the last couple of years, the excess duty bill. So consumption taxes have especially grown quite well, but corporate tax, pay as you earn, those have somewhat slowed. And I think for us it's just to see what the minister is going to do from that perspective.
All right, let's talk about some of the big winners, and of course infrastructure, which you've talked about, education as well, and health. Just looking at how the development plan has been done for these particular sectors, who is a big winner for you?
I'd say the overall economy, because if you look at, for example, the World Economic Forum that was held in Kigali only a few weeks ago, one of the main challenges we described in East African countries is the infrastructure problem. We have what we call an infrastructure bottleneck. The cost of power, the cost of energy is very expensive. For example, in Kenya, we are paying about 22 shillings per kilowatt hour compared to Ethiopia, where they only pay 5 shillings per kilowatt hour. So if you're interested in... But
Ethiopia is highly subsidized. That's not weighing apples to apples.
True, but even if you compare with the sub-Saharan average, which is still about maybe 10 shillings per kilowatt hour, we see we are not doing our manufacturing sector major service if we don't bring down the cost of energy. So I think investments in the geothermal energy, investments in more hydro, I think net is going to boost consumer demand. So I think the winners are going to be almost every small businesses that encounter high cost of business, things around security. For example, we are seeing they're allowing the police to buy almost 2,400 vehicles to map security, because security again has been a major issue around tourism, for example. So I think net I think I'm very optimistic with the direction that CS Rotich has taken, and I think I would say manufacturing, infrastructure and consumption will be the main determinants for growth.
But some of those projects that you have mentioned,
yes,
they look like they're stagnant. You said they're budgeting for, but you look at Konza City, LAPSSET, what has happened?
Well, I don't think you'd say they're stagnant, because the standard gauge railway is 70% complete. In fact,
that one I have no issue with. What about LAPSSET?
LAPSSET, okay, the issue around LAPSSET is it has a regional dimension to it. It brings in Ethiopia, it brings in other countries, and I think when you manage a project that has an international dimension, there are still some aspects that have to be almost balanced, as opposed to the standard gauge railway, which was simply from, at least from this stage, from Mombasa to Nairobi. But I still see LAPSSET being a major player, possibly in the next possibly in the next election cycle. But I agree with you. Some of the big criticisms that have been forwarded against this administration is we are spending too much money on big infrastructure projects and incurring debt. But I think the fact that these infrastructure projects can drive future growth, I think it still makes it a very positive element towards future planning.
All right. What is your thoughts about how the government allocated, recurrent expenditure and development expenditure? Because they have been accused of, putting too much on recurrent and not enough on development. But for the first time in a long time, Parliament actually said, stop. You're doing too many projects at the same time. Yeah,
and I think that's a concern. I think development expenditures now are probably around 35%. And really the main issue is that can we really reduce our recurrent expenditure? And in fact, for development expenditure, we're actually borrowing everything. So we're actually not spending any of the amount of money we collect for any development expenditure. We're actually borrowing the entire bit of development, and that's a concern for us. I think also a big priority. I think infrastructure is important, but is there a need to prioritize? So maybe what infrastructure projects would have the best impact within a certain period? Of course, there's the issue of utilizing that money well, but I think also prioritizing a specific infrastructure to have the best impact on the economy, I think would be critically important. I think the IMF suggested that there's need to actually relook at some of the projects, delay some where possible if you don't need to. The airport, for example, I mean, if we look at the current capacity, we can actually see that we have sufficient capacity for the foreseeable couple of years. So I think the idea of actually terminating it was still quite okay. Maybe focus on a second runway, which really improves the airport. On electricity, I think while it's important to still invest in electricity, I think the focus now should be on the transmission system and distribution. I think we already have sufficient power. If we look at, we have 35% spare capacity. I think also the focus is how do you create these industrial zones? If you're looking at, say, Dongo Kundu, how do you activate that special economic zone so that you actually have manufacturers setting up and starting to utilize this electricity, so that electricity production goes hand in hand with consumption, and that's the only way actually you're going to reduce the cost, because you have also to consider the capacity charges. So if you don't increase consumption, then this new power you're bringing in, while partly it replaces the expensive thermal power, now we are moving into a situation where we need to really increase the demand side.
Mm-hmm. Why are we having problems in distribution?
So on distribution there are several things. So the transmission system is not well, it was underinvested for many years. So what happened, for example, you had certain areas like Garissa only recently got connected to the grid. So what it did, Garissa you have to put a generator, not because you didn't have electricity in Kenya, but because you don't have a transmission grid to take power to Garissa. I think there's also another important transmission line being constructed between Mombasa and Nairobi to really tap into the geothermal power, which is also quite cheap. So that focus is quite important. I think government has been putting effort along that. And then from a socio-economic development point of view, you need to also get distribution to the final consumer. And I think the idea of increasing the distribution network to reach the rural areas, while they might not consume much, I think that's an important step for people to start, because without electricity you won't buy a fridge, you won't buy all these other equipment which actually consume electricity. So I think that focus is extremely important, to really ensure that you achieve some of the objectives.
All right, let's talk about financing the budget at 1.49 trillion. Of course, that's, as you mentioned earlier, the largest and most ambitious budget we've seen this government undertaking. Where is he going to get all this money? We know the revenues from KRA have been falling.
Right, and there are two types of debt. Pretty much they're going to try and bridge that gap from a domestic angle, which which is pretty much raising money from the local economy, and they're going to try to borrow from abroad, the kind of Eurobonds or the kind of
another one.
Pretty much try and get funds from abroad. So the question is, what's the right balance? And there's been a lot of commentary in the papers that possibly Kenya could be growing too much debt far too quickly. But maybe at this point, I would like to remind the audience that the government has a medium-term debt strategy plan which guides how much debt the country can incur at any single point. Are we incurring too much debt from China, for example, which is funding the standard gauge railway? The question is, I think you have to look at it from a long-term perspective. What economic value will the standard gauge railway bring to the economy, as opposed to how much are we borrowing from China? So in as much as
if I may interrupt you in that case, isn't there an issue? People raising now that Uganda has gone through Tanzania, Rwanda the same, and the standard gauge railway getting Naivasha. If it gets Busia, or what use is it if it can't go beyond there?
Well, anytime you put a major infrastructure project like a railway or a road, it has spillover benefits to the surrounding community. At the very beginning, it increases the value of the land around the area. Second of all, you have to employ the local youth in that area to be able to participate in the projects. I agree some of the criticisms against the Chinese have been the spillover benefits have not really being felt. Perhaps they're not hiring as many locals as we would like them to see. Perhaps,
or importing cement from China.
Exactly, and they're not, and we've seen it. China's relationship with Africa, this has always been a prevailing theme, especially in countries like Zambia, for example, where they had to legislate on what exactly can foreigners do and what can Zambians do. But I think net-net, if you look at it from a debt perspective, we are 50%, still within the 50% debt to GDP ratio. The IMF has already endorsed that to be fairly sustainable if these projects will yield future growth prospects.
I don't know whether you read Devin Day's article on Saturday about the same.
I did.
And it's very doubtful about the viability of the same. What do you say about that?
I mean, if you compare Kenya with the developed countries in the States, in Europe, these countries have over 100% debt to GDP. Japan has 200% debt to GDP. So for Kenya, given that it's still a developing economy, 50% debt to GDP, I think is still within a reasonable context. It's almost like if you look at your personal finances, if half of your income is going towards servicing debt, anything more than that becomes a bit strenuous. In fact, a bank will not give you a loan if your debt to your salary is more than 50%. So I think there's a consensus that if you keep it below 50%, then it's still sustainable. So the questions are, will these projects unlock the true value as the government has promised? Those are the questions that we still need to debate on, especially things around corruption, which we still keep hearing on. But I think net-net I'm still optimistic that these projects will take us to the next.
The question people have been asking whether when the railway is complete,
yes,
the SGR is complete,
yes,
goes all the way to Busia, wherever,
yes,
at the end of Kenya,
yes,
and the Ugandans are not going to bring up, and the Rwandese, and they're not coming through us. What is it for? What will it be transporting?
I don't think they've officially said that they will not link to the standard gauge railway. I think what they have commented is the partnership with Tanzania is also viable. There is nothing in the East African Community Charter that says you can't have multiple interconnections of railways. Same thing with the oil pipeline. That was a big, people felt that Kenya got a bit shortchanged. There is nothing to say that in the next 2 years, 3 years, we cannot still plug into the Uganda-Tanzania scheme. So I think sometimes there is a lot of debate, is Kenya still the main big boy in the East African community? Is Kenya losing its competitive advantage in the region? But I'm still I still feel like Kenya is still heads and shoulders above its neighbors, and in as much as these projects might go across us, we still have opportunity to build those gaps, especially given the fact that we're going towards a common market in 2022. East African community want to have a common currency. All these things will come to bear in those few years.
Eric, I want to get your thoughts on debt. Are you worried about how much debt the government is taking on?
Well, Probably not so much. I think if you look at the taxable capacity of the economy, there's still a lot of room in terms of reforms that can yield good returns. So if you saw the introduction of the rental tax, there was excess duty, which is also performing very well. And my sense also is that with the current level of the oil prices, there's room to actually focus on higher taxes on oil. I think the main issue is just how that spending is actually done. I think, like the standard gauge railway, I think the question is, if you look at the East African Railway master plan, actually all this infrastructure is good for the region. I think the main issue is that for Kenya, they think the idea is actually to have Kenya Railway also go into Congo, Kinshasa. So Kisangani, I think, and from that you'll actually be able to open up part of Congo. That traffic could come into Kenya, and still Uganda will be an important market. We have a lot to learn as well from other countries. Tanzania has been very good in its rail network. So if you look, even though they have the meter gauge network, it is spread out across the country. And I think that's something that, as a country, we still have the meter gauge railway. Maybe we can still extend that and ensure that, as a country, we have a well spread out rail network. We still have the fast network, but still the other network to sort of ensure that as a country we are well serviced, different parts of the economy. So for me, I'm not particularly concerned about the debt. It's how the money is spent. And I think there's a lot of focus on just the standard gauge railway. If you look at, for example, the other big infrastructure projects, there's the 115 billion Kitale Lodwar South Sudan road, which is a big investment. The various bypasses which have also been invested quite heavily. So it's not true to say like the standard gauge rail is the main infrastructure project. We've actually had many other projects, smaller in scale, but also quite impactful and have contributed in total to the debt level that we have. But I think the idea is to, are we getting value for money for all these projects?
And I think if I could add on to that, if you look at from the 1901, the economic history of Kenya, a lot of the economic activity has been on the lower half of Kenya. From Mombasa all into Kisumu, you could almost draw a very nice arc. And for me, the question is, what about the northern part of the country, which is actually far much bigger in terms of geographical space than the lower half? There's been very little economic activity concentrated up there, and for me that's why projects like LAPSET are extremely important, because they were unlocking almost the potential of half a country which has for almost 100 years not been viable.
There's been talk about taxing the rich, and this is about income tax per se. During the celebrations on the 1st of June, the president did not increase, basic wages, but he did insinuate, possibility of cushioning those that earn below a certain level. And I'm just wondering about your expectations. Do you think income tax is going to be higher within some brackets?
I think there is a plan to review the income tax law, and to ensure that the brackets are much more, because the cost of living has actually gone up over the last couple of years. Just ensure that the brackets are sort of spread out, so in terms of the minimum tax and how you graduate it up to the maximum level. I think that's different from the minimum wage, and the minimum wage is really to create that level to ensure that our labor is competitive, and we need to move towards a productivity-based economy, and I think that's important because that's the only way we're going to attract investment into the economy and ensure people actually have jobs. There's no need of having a very high minimum salary, yet you have youth unemployment is at 65%. That youth would rather have a job that pays them a certain level, they can get the experience and then build up from there. But increasingly, I think employers would like to pay based on productivity, and I think that should be a key focus, on the economy. But even as we look at income tax reforms, and there is the idea that we're still going to have income tax reforms, I think there's been a raft of changes in terms of legislation, and I think that will be one of them. But I think taxing the rich is not necessarily on income tax alone. There's now capital gains tax. It wasn't implemented on the shares. I think that's because our market is still quite underdeveloped. But it's now, on property. It's something that we are looking at. That the government is looking at quite keenly. There's a rental tax, which essentially taxes property owners. And I think when you're looking at taxation, we also need to look at the county revenues, property taxes. How can we reduce rent seeking on our economy? Because also we need to support business and encourage businesses. So if you put a lot of hurdles to businesses, you see a lot of rent seeking and people doing a lot of real estate, which really doesn't create jobs in the scale that you would want. So I think also the focus would be to move towards taxes which encourage enterprise, so not taxes which discourage rent seeking, and taxes which encourage enterprise. And that way, even if the rich make more money, I think for the economy as a whole, you'll actually benefit, because you'll actually have businesses which have created many more rich people as well.
Isn't there a huge chunk of population, particularly in the formal sector, that is not taxed?
So yeah, so the formal tax actually, formal jobs, if you look at new jobs being created, 85% of new jobs come from the informal sector. So the question is, how do you bring this dark economy into the formal sector? And government has been trying to do that very cleverly. If you look at the public transport sector, they've now been put into circles. It doesn't necessarily mean that you want money. You want a bit of formalization. You want to ensure the employers can provide national social security for the people when they retire. NHIF, how do you provide health care? There are new legislations. How do you focus on real estate agents? How do you focus on SMEs, what we call maybe the Juakali sector? How do you scale them up? All these are very important businesses in terms of creating employment, but increasingly government needs to focus on them because they're just such a big part of the economy. But you need to formalize them, because people with what you call just informal employment really don't enjoy the other benefits, and also when their businesses grow, you don't really get that benefit as well. And the dark economy is also bad for the formal economy, because you have the differences. Some people might not pay taxes, others are paying taxes, issues of illicit and so forth. So how do you ensure that all these things can be addressed progressively in the economy? And if you're saying you want to reduce taxes, you need more people to be in the tax bracket, so that you can actually cut down on the tax level, overall tax level.
Now, according to the budget policy statement, and I just want to pick up from what you talked about counties. So counties have a bit more money this time around, at least according to the BPS that was released in February.
Right.
But it's still not enough.
Correct. One of the challenges counties have had is they've never been able to raise sufficient revenue to be able to meet their own expenditure. Actually, what I heard was counties were actually raising less than what the previous local authorities used to raise in the previous administration. And one of the big debates among economists is, how do we get counties to create policies that encourage enterprise but don't don't confound the businesses there? One of the big answers to that is, should we levy a property tax, for example, or a land tax in these counties? The Constitution actually allows counties to levy property taxes or land taxes, especially on idle land, for example, just to be able to minimize the effect of idle land on the economy. Because when you have idle land, it means you're not as productive as you can be, and as you are shifting towards a more productive economy, all the means of production have to be brought to bear. So I think issues around property taxes, I think we need to take those more seriously, as opposed to where we were seeing, for example, in Kiambu County, even chicken farmers will have to pay taxes, and very people who are starting off. So when you create so many inhibitors to these small businesses, the likelihood that they will want to remain informal is actually very high. So I think the bigger conversation is, can we look at things like property taxes, land taxes, to raise revenue for these counties? And
the feeling is across the board is that counties are so dependent on the national budget, not because they're not able to create their own revenue, but they're saying that we can get money anyway from the national government. What do you how do you respond to that?
I think raising taxes is difficult, and I think most county governments are taking the easy route. They would rather if the national government takes most of the blame in terms of trying to raise taxes. But the reality is that the county governments have a mandate to actually raise taxes in a certain way. Maybe the idea would be, maybe they should coordinate in some way to ensure that there's no political backlash if they make certain decisions. I think that would be a better direction, because I think the issue of land is a major one. If you look at one of the issues raised by Uganda when they were deciding to go through Tanzania, one of the main issues was compensation on land. And we know, like the standard gauge railway, from Nairobi to Mombasa, while the railway costed 327 billion, we actually had compensation of about 120 billion. So essentially, you're seeing compensation on land being a third of the cost of projects, and that's really not sustainable. And a lot of this land is idle. But I think even differentiating idle land and not idle land is really very difficult. The idea is just to tax all land in a certain way based on where it's located, or based on how infrastructure has serviced that land. And then if you're doing productive work, it should be a sufficient tax to be able to pay. If you're not doing anything on the land, then of course it becomes a burden to you. And that's going to put people in the right direction, because these days, in fact, having an empty property, empty land, it appreciates faster than somebody who's doing business on it, or you've done a small business, which is a really unfair way of the economy functioning. So I think,
Eric, is it really possible to separate politics, finances and budget, especially we're going into an election year, and we have seen how the Jubilee government has performed, and some say they totally forgot about Vision 2030, and everything they're focusing on is the Jubilee manifesto and the Jubilee promises. That's where perhaps even LAPSET is falling behind, because they're focusing so much on what they said this is what the Jubilee government is going to deliver. So can you really separate the politics and the finances?
I think we need to strike a balance. It's important to be within Vision 2030, but again also, as you elect politicians, what manifesto are they going to bring out there, and what target do you as an electorate place on them? So I think it's trying to look at how you can balance Vision 2030, and of course other things also come along the way. And how do you finance all these projects? I think a lot of these projects are all good, but how do you prioritize and how do you finance? So how do you take into public-private partnerships? How do you, innovative ways of financing all these projects? Because I think that's one of the key areas. We are short of cash, but the projects, we really have quite a good number of them. But it's really difficult to separate politics and finance from a practical perspective. But I hear you on the challenges there.
Ken, you're the optimistic one.
Economics is about how do you the most efficient method of allocating resources. Politics is about what's the most equitable way of managing resources, and at the end of the day, efficiency and equity have to be balanced, because you can have a very efficient system that creates income inequality, for example, and that's a big criticism of what we have in Kenya. We're having growth in the service sectors, like in finance, like in telecoms, but if you look at the sectors that employ 3/4 of the population, like agriculture, they're still very slow. So what happens is you have huge income inequalities, which can create strife, which can give an opportunity for agitation amongst people. So I think politics and economics are very good bedfellows, and they have to be able to be managed efficiently. The Jubilee government has a mandate to deliver its projects, but also it cannot do so without having sort of like a transparent way of managing its resources in an efficient way.
Let me ask about another thing about importation. Should the government control import? The reason I'm asking this is because if you walk out throughout every township in Kenya,
Right.
there's a lot of stuff from China, which is rubbish, which is being hawked. It comes in containers, millions of them. Everybody is hawking nonsense. Should the government not control import?
If you compare countries like Kenya and, for example, Ethiopia, one of the reasons Kenya is so attractive to international investors is it follows the creed of the free markets.
Yes.
And that's why when we raised the Eurobonds 2 years ago, we had a massive oversubscription. Now when investors start feeling that not only are you're no longer a free market, you are not a predictable market, people tend to disappear. So the question is, do we still want to be a bright spot in the regional markets, in international markets? Because in future we'll still need credit from international markets. And if that's the case, we have to maintain free market principles, which means having transparent policies around import, and not just importation, even interest rates. In the banking sector, one of the criticisms was should be control interest rates because the loans in Kenya are too high. But the moment you start controlling one lever of the economy, the question is, what else will you start controlling? And at the end of it all, you'll end up with a closed economy, like in South America, where some countries where you go to the supermarket and you can't find any sugar, you can't find any local substances. So I still believe in the free market principles, but I agree with you, sometimes even those they cannot be left to their own devices. They have to be within a legislative framework that makes sense to the producers on the ground, the retailers, and also, because Kenya is also part of the World Trade Organization, which has its own policies on regional trade and commerce and the East African community. So it's a balance.
But when you see people importing toothpaste, surely why should the government, any government like Kenya, allow the importation of toothpicks?
The reason that's happening is because, as I said earlier, the cost of manufacturing in Kenya is very high, and that's the reason our competitive sector is not, our manufacturing sector is not very competitive, and that's why we are seeing the ever-readies moving out of Kenya, because the cost of electricity, the cost of power is too high. What the government should do is not block the toothpicks from being imported. They should actually look at what are the reasons that manufacturing is so expensive. Why is the cost of power so high? How can we reduce that so that other people can be competitive in their manufacturing and actually be able to sell at an affordable price? Because even if you introduce those legislations, a black market will all of a sudden be created. People will still import the cheap sugar, the cheap toothpicks. It's just now it won't be in a manageable sense. So I think we need to look at the framework. Why is manufacturing in Kenya so expensive? Why is the cost of business? The World Economic Forum has a cost of doing business index. Why is Kenya always a bit stagnant? Sometimes it goes up a point or two. Those are the things that we need to do. And it's not just around energy. It's about security. It's about contract enforcement, the judiciary, how quickly can it be compensated. It's a whole body of work that has to be implemented, and that is what will make us more competitive, because at the end of the day it's about productivity.
You've talked, Eric.
I think one of the things to note is that Kenya has been a beneficiary of global trade. If you look at our tea, we export it in more than 50 countries. If you look at our flowers, exports to Europe, coffee and so forth. So trying to restrict trade will actually be negative to us as well if you now attract reciprocation in terms of our key exports. So that's really not the solution. You mentioned
even when it comes to toothpicks.
Your toothpicks, we really don't have the capacity to produce toothpicks. You know, toothpicks, you require bamboos. You require bamboo, and that's how you're able to produce it. Really, there's no reason why I shouldn't, but we don't really have farmers growing bamboo. Yeah, so that's really not the problem. That's not the problem of the importer. The problem with the importer is that maybe now we've created, now we have a market. Now the enterprises in Kenya need to look, maybe we should be growing bamboo in our forest. How can we ensure that maybe if you want to deal with, because we've been saying let's grow trees in our forest, let's grow bamboo. And we know bamboo is a very big part of trade globally. In China, it's a very big component, and you know, make money out of it, you know, because that bamboo produces quite a number of products. So I think it's not really the problem of importance, it's our own problem not being able to put in place structures to actually address that. And then also remember, consumers have been big beneficiaries of global trade. If you want to import cheap products, that's how you're able to improve the cost of living for the poor mwananchi. You know, second-hand clothes, or you know, anything that is affordable from China actually helps the common person. The idea is, how do we address the challenges that we have? Because I think we could. The machinery we have these days, you're having very affordable machinery into the economy. You can't industrialize without machinery, and I think those are some of the things that we are benefiting from global trade. If you have it open, we shall be eventually be able to build up capacity and be able to also export in other markets. I mean, if you also look at East African community, we are really mainly proponents of open trade. I think that's really where Kenya should focus on, but the idea would be just addressing some of the inadequacies that the economy faces, but really not do any restrictions.
All right, we're about to come to an end, and I just want us to take some final comments. Any surprises you're expecting tomorrow?
In terms of, I don't think I have major surprises, but I would really like to see the government talk more about the other sectors besides infrastructure. I think we've belabored the infrastructure point for far too long. I'd like to see what the social services are, what's happening in that space in terms of education, in terms of healthcare, because ultimately these are the pillars that build up an economy in the long term, that build up aggregate demand. So I'd like to see what policies do we have in terms of education that is relevant, that produces graduates who not only need to be employed, but can also create their own businesses and enterprises. Those are the questions that I'd like to see in terms of funding being addressed.
All right. Eric?
For me, I'd want to see a government which is a little bit more innovative in some of the things, in addressing some of the challenges that face the economy. For example, I think there was the Kenya Space Agency, which was sort of passed last year, and that can be used in different areas in terms of addressing security, mapping, you know, food. So how do you use innovative ways to actually address some of the challenges at an affordable cost? I think that's really my main objective, because taxes, I think we'll still continue seeing taxes, but how do you ensure that this money is utilized well?
All right.
Yes.
Well, maybe my problem, everything here, as you said, is corruption. What do you do with corruption? That if they can sort out that, because a lot of money is being used. These days it looks like all those things we're talking about, infrastructure, and they are being made so that somebody can benefit. It's called it a rent seeking. I think that's a major problem.
Right.
All right, and with that we come to the end of our conversation this morning. We've been unpacking the 1.49 trillion shilling budget that will be unveiled tomorrow by Cabinet Secretary Rotich. And with me in studio we had Ken Gishinga, Chief Economist of Mentoria Consulting, Eric Musal, Senior Research Associate at Standard Investment Bank, and of course my co-host Mutegi Njau. I am Terry Ann Chabet. Have a good morning.